that they'll send American jihadists to carry out attacks back home. Plus, dangerous weather alert. 20 million people now face a severe weather threat, including possible tornadoes. I'm Wolf Blitzer. You're in the Situation Room. Terrorists leave a trail of blood and graphic video evidence of their crimes as they move toward Baghdad. By showing off their mass executions, the jihadists seem intent on stirring up an all-out civil war. They're also showing off what they claim to be captured firepower. Iraq's Air Force is hitting back at the insurgents, and President Obama is weighing airstrikes and even direct talks with Iran as options to address the crisis. The United States is moving some staffers out of its embassy in Baghdad and moving more troops into a different area to protect the complex, while others move into the region for possible evacuation duty. From the Pentagon to Iraq, our correspondents and analysts, they are standing by to bring you the kind of coverage only CNN can deliver. Let's begin with our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto. Jim?
Wolf, tonight the president is convening his national security team to discuss options for a U.S. response, including military options. We're told he will make his decision with urgency. This as ISIS militants and their Iraqi Sunni allies captured another Iraqi city, Tal Afar, near Mosul, firming their grip on the northern part of the country with a campaign of brutal violence. These are the forces now ruling northern Iraq. ISIS militants taunting and humiliating captured Iraqi soldiers. These are Maliki's dogs, he said, and we are the soldiers of God. Moments later, one is executed on camera. Here, similar violence, but on an enormous scale. 1,700 soldiers, claims ISIS, captured, paraded, then shot in cold blood. A mass killing unseen in Iraq since the days of Saddam Hussein. CNN cannot independently confirm the authenticity of these images. Tonight, the president is convening his national security team to review options for a U.S. response. The USS Mesa Verde, with 550 Marines on board, arrived in the Persian Gulf to help with a possible evacuation of Americans, joining the carrier George H.W. Bush. Secretary Kerry, in an interview with Yahoo News, acknowledged airstrikes on Iraqi targets are now under consideration.
When you have people murdering, assassinating in these mass massacres, you have to stop that. And you do what you need to do if you need to try to stop it from the air or otherwise.
With or without military action, U.S. officials emphasize a political compromise bringing Iraqi Sunnis and Kurds into the Shiite-dominated government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki must be a part of any response, and it must be immediate.
If we engage in a military action without a political solution, we will be seen as backing Maliki in a Sunni-Shia civil war, and that is exactly the opposite of what we want to do.
The political effort may extend all the way to neighboring Iran. U.S. officials saying today that Washington is open to direct talks on Iraq with Iranian officials. Ryan Crocker was U.S. ambassador to Iraq during some of the worst sectarian violence in the mid-2000s.
The stakes are very high here. This is Al-Qaeda 6.0. And if they consolidate their territorial gains, they will be in a stronger position than they ever were in Afghanistan prior to 9/11. We know how that turned out.
Increasing the fears of a possible civil war is the fact that the battle lines are already mirroring Iraq's ethnic lines. Look at this. These are the cities that ISIS militants have taken over or taken parts over, and this is the Sunni part of the country here. This, the Kurdish part, roughly, and this, the Shia part. These are essentially the battle lines in that country right now. Things to watch going forward. Fallujah is now an ISIS stronghold. It's a path into Baghdad here. Do they take advantage of it? We would add to the path from the north a real danger for Baghdad going forward. In fact, they already have many contacts in the western part of Baghdad, allowing them to carry out bombing attacks. It's also a potential path to the south, the Shia-dominated south, and the religious sites here. The other thing to watch going forward is, what does Iran do? Iran right now has some 300 or so, it's estimated, Quds Force militants. These are sort of like Iranian Green Berets, special forces, largely advisory role. If Iran sends in more troops, more regular troops, infantry battalions, that kind of thing, that's the kind of involvement which will increase this split. Iran, remembering, supporting the Shias, the Sunnis here, and the Kurds up here. This is exactly the kind of map and the kind of divisions, Wolf, that many advisors, many U.S. officials are worried about right now.
All right, Jim, stand by. Aside from putting boots on the ground, President Obama says he's open to all options on Iraq, and administration officials have been huddling now for several days. The president is arriving back at the White House this hour, and a decision may be looming. Let's get the very latest from our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. Jim, the president is now back in Washington.
That's right, and President Obama, Wolf, is due to arrive back here at the White House any moment now. We understand he has not made any final decisions on Iraq, but later on this evening, as Jim mentioned, he will be meeting with his national security team to review his options for dealing with the ISIS threat. One White House official tells us the president has a fundamental set of options in front of him, but that those options could be tweaked or changed before a course of action is taken. One option we have heard about here at the White House is that the U.S. could expand its already existing training programs for Iraqi security forces. But National Security spokeswoman Caitlin Hayden cautions that ramping up training in Iraq would not put troops in a combat role. The president said he's not going to do that. Aides to the president also say they are stressing that any military strike against Iraq would be limited in scope. Incoming White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest told reporters aboard Air Force One that any action would not lead to a, quote, open-ended commitment. And White House officials, we should say, are also downplaying just how much the U.S. would work with Iran in containing the ISIS threat. Earnest told reporters there are no plans for any military coordination between the U.S. and Iran, only that officials from both countries may speak on the sidelines at this week's discussions in Geneva regarding Iran's nuclear program. But, Wolf, there is deep concern here at the White House over ISIS. A senior administration official told me the national security team was working this situation with the same urgency throughout the weekend as we saw last week. And as we know, last week, Wolf, it got pretty intense.
Quick question. Do we know if the president will be meeting tonight with his national security advisors in the Oval Office, in the Situation Room at the White House, or some other room? I ask the question because if it's in the Situation Room at the White House, they can have video conferencing, they can bring in military commanders. All of a sudden, it ramps up the possibility that the president may be moving towards some sort of military action.
That's exactly right, Wolf. And we understand that those national security meetings were happening here at the White House throughout the weekend. And then the national security advisor, Susan Rice, was keeping the president up to speed on how all of those meetings were going. We don't have precisely the location of tonight's meeting. We'll work on that information, get it back to you, Wolf.
All right, Jim Acosta at the White House. We'll monitor that. That was video.
Now.
Yeah, I hear Marine One arriving on the south lawn of the White House right now. We'll stay on top of this story. As the terrorists advance, thousands of Americans could be in harm's way. We're getting new information on the possible military steps the president could authorize and the forces that are available. Let's bring in our Pentagon correspondent, Barbara Starr. She has details. Barbara?
Wolf, at this hour, the Pentagon has put a lot in place. Ships, aircraft, missiles, everything that they would need to carry out an option, a military option for the president. It just awaits a decision. As the fighting rages on in Iraq, the Pentagon is moving more firepower and manpower into the region to prepare for whatever President Obama orders. Already at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, dozens of Marines and Army troops have moved in to beef up security. A top priority, evacuate all Americans at the embassy if it comes to that. The aircraft carrier George H.W. Bush and 5 other warships are now in the Persian Gulf. More than 500 Marines and dozens of helicopters are on standby if an evacuation is ordered. The former top U.S. commander for the region warns it may not be enough.
I also think we ought to have a more robust capability to evacuate Americans if necessary. I don't believe just the carrier itself. I would like to see an amphibious ready group in there, more helicopters, more Marines.
Fighter jets on the carrier could be used to strike ISIS targets. The U.S. has increased drone surveillance over western and northern Iraq in an effort to gather more intelligence to share with Iraqi forces for targeting ISIS on the ground. But a former U.S. commander in Iraq says it will be very tough.
it's the same reason it was so hard to target them when we had 160,000 troops there. They intermingle with the people. You know, I think some of the media has shown these truck convoys going down the roads, and I think the uninitiated might say, hey, what's so hard about that? Let's just drop a couple bombs.
President Obama has ruled out troops on the ground, but can there be effective military strikes without putting some troops in to find out exactly where ISIS fighters are operating?
I do believe we ought to put special forces teams on the ground with the Iraqi forces, certainly with the Kurds and the Peshmerga in the north, and also with the Jordanians. They can provide some of that ground intelligence.
So now one of the most critical intelligence questions for the U.S. military is whether these ISIS fighters can make it all the way to Baghdad and challenge authority in that city. Some U.S. officials are telling us no, that the ISIS fighters will encounter very well-trained Shia-based security forces from the Iraqi government and that they will be stopped. But if they do make it to Baghdad, if they were to attack the airport in Baghdad, that really changes the equation, and many say then the U.S. would have to move in and use some of those assets to evacuate all Americans out of the U.S. Embassy. Still no decision about any of it.
We'll see what the president decides if he makes a decision tonight at his national security meeting. Barbara, thank you. Up next, see you guys in New York. That was a chilling warning from the man who now leads the brutal terror group rampaging through Iraq. Will it bring the deadly violence to America? And will the upheaval in Iraq with its strategic oil fields have you paying more at the pump? We're standing by to take a closer look. President Obama has just returned to the White House and is calling an urgent meeting of his top national security team to review his options for potential military action in Iraq, possibly including airstrikes. We're covering all angles of this fast-moving story with our correspondents and our guests. Let's begin in Baghdad with CNN senior international correspondent Nick Robertson. He has the very latest. Nick.
Well, Wolf, as ISIS reveals its bloody tactics to promote violence in this country with execution videos, Baghdad itself is nervously awaiting what may happen next. ISIS gaining more ground, moving closer to Baghdad. The U.S. embassy there, fortified security, more U.S. Marines being brought in, some staffers being evacuated, taken into other, safer Iraqi cities. On the capital streets outside, an Iraqi policeman nervously eyes passing cars. Busier than the past few days, fears the city is about to be engulfed in fighting, subsiding, but not gone. Prices in food markets are up. Potatoes from 80 cents to $1.50, this lady says. But it's cooking gas up fivefold that really upsets her. Why, she says, everything is working fine. Stalls are well stocked. On the surface, almost seems like normal, but it's not. This ex-supplier tells us for the first time ever, officials are clamping down on prices as the government tries to stave off panic and price gouging. It seems, though, almost the least of their worries. The imminent threat from the north leaves the Iraqi government desperate for soldiers, calling on volunteers. Hundreds of civilians, young and old, marching through the streets of Baghdad, now having to defend their country. And in the north, ISIS taking the town of Tal Afar. The terrorists possibly gaining control over its army base, which would mean more armoured vehicles, weapons and ammunition up for grabs. Some of the weaponry provided by the US. Asking his identity be concealed, CNN's Arwa Damon interviewing an Iraqi colonel who says his unit alone left behind 25 Humvees, 80 other vehicles and trucks, 10 sniper rifles and 20 rocket launchers when they fled.
If Baghdad falls, if the central government falls, a disaster awaits us of monumental proportions.
With minimal resources or little control on the ground, the Iraqi military uses aerial strikes to target ISIS positions in Mosul, Iraq's second largest city.
Now it's more dangerous than before. And this will definitely would not be restricted to the boundaries of these countries. It will spill over to Europe, and the terrorism could spread to the world at large.
The Iraqi Air Force says it has killed 200 ISIS fighters. The advance may have slowed, but they're still on the move, and their aim is this city, Baghdad. Wolf?
That's the capital, a city of some 9 million people. Nick Robertson, thanks very much. The disturbing developments in Iraq have oil prices spiking around the world to the highest level in almost a year, just as world demand is hitting its peak season. And that's even though the militants' advance hasn't impacted Iraqi oil production, at least not yet. But there is growing concern as the militant group known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, seizes control of more Iraqi territory, including major cities which American troops fought to free from insurgents just a few years ago. CNN's Anderson Cooper is now in Baghdad himself. Anderson, you've only been there a few hours, but set the scene for us. What are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Well, certainly there's a lot of concern over the fall of the city of Tal Afar, which Nick Robertson mentioned a few moments ago, a city of some 200,000 in the northwest of Iraq, not too far from Mosul, a city of an ethnic group called Turkmen, of both Sunni and Shia, many of whom now are said to have fled into the desert now that ISIS has taken over that city, certainly raising a lot more questions, Wolf, about the capabilities of the Iraqi military, a military which vastly outnumbers ISIS forces and yet seems incapable of stopping them on the field of the battle. As Nick mentioned, there have been thousands of volunteers after a call by the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani here, mostly Iraqi Shia, heeding that call, volunteers saying they're willing to fight. But again, real questions about their capabilities, their experience on the battlefield, and exactly how they will be used to try to protect this city of Baghdad and also used to try to bolster the sagging morale of the Iraqi military forces. So there's a lot of questions here. Obviously, this city is very much on edge. It has probably changed over the last several days. There was a suicide attack yesterday, which certainly shattered a lot of nerves, killed about 10 people. Seems a little bit calmer today, but clearly a city on edge, unsure about the capabilities of their government, what their government really can do to try to stop these ISIS forces, Will.
What was it like, Anderson, just coming into Baghdad? I assume you arrived at the Baghdad airport. You had to drive in to the city. Did you see troops on the way? Did you see any evidence of a heightened security presence there?
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, what's interesting, this is a city of rumor right now. This is really a country of rumor. Even flying in today, there were all these rumors that there had been fighting at the airport, shelling at the airport, none of which we saw any evidence of. Those turned out to just be rumors. But that was a real concern. Some flights were delayed when we came in. Again, it was nightfall. There is a curfew here around midnight. We were able to make it in under the curfew, but the road from the airport to the city, which is a road which has always been dangerous, particularly the worst of the times, even when U.S. forces were here, is again a risky road. A lot of Iraqi security forces, multiple checkpoints, as Nick mentioned. Checkpoints have increased here in this city, not just in the number of them, but the number of people manning each checkpoint. They check the vehicles very carefully. There's real concern, not just about ISIS insurgents coming into the city of Baghdad, but the knowledge also that there are already insurgents here. The fact that there was a suicide bombing yesterday, someone walking with a suicide vest exploded himself, killed a lot of people, and wounded even many more. Tells you there are, what we have known for a long time, that there are insurgents already in this city, and the security threat is not one that is just coming to the city, but one that's already here.
Anderson Cooper in Baghdad. Anderson, we'll stay in close touch with you. Be careful over there. This important note to our viewers. Anderson, of course, will be anchoring his program from Baghdad later tonight. AC 360 starts 8 p.m. Eastern. That's some breaking news out of Iraq. Coming out of the White House, our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, is joining us. What's going on? What are you hearing, Jim?
Well, Wolf, we can tell you that in just the last few minutes, the White House has released a letter that the president has sent to the Speaker, John Boehner. This is a War Powers letter that was sent over to Congress, officially notifying lawmakers that the president has authorized the deployment of 275 U.S. Armed Forces personnel. Those personnel will basically be in Baghdad there to provide security and support for U.S. personnel on the ground in Iraq, in Baghdad, and also to the embassy in Baghdad. One thing we should point out in this letter, I think it's very interesting, Wolf, It says that this force will remain in Iraq until the security situation becomes such that it is no longer needed. And an email from the White House Press Secretary Jay Carney hit our inboxes in just the last few minutes, making the note that these forces are coming into Iraq with the understanding of the Iraqi government, with the support of the Iraqi government. So the president meeting with his national security team to go over options for Iraq later on this evening, and we'll, of course, have more as the night goes on.
So in effect, the president acknowledging in this letter to Congress, these potentially could be combat troops. Here's the question: will they have immunity from any Iraqi prosecution if they will? Because as you remember, that was a big issue when all U.S. troops withdrew at the end of 2011.
I think that is unclear at this point, Wolf. Obviously, that was a key sticking point. That is part of the reason why this White House says U.S. forces are still not on the ground in Baghdad, or were not left in Baghdad as a residual force after the president pulled those forces out of Iraq in late 2011. But I think that's a key question. It's a key question going forward because, as we understand, Wolf, one of the other options the president is looking at is deploying forces to Iraq to provide training to Iraqi security forces. It's certainly a question that will have to be worked out.
275 combat troops, U.S. troops, going to Baghdad right now to help protect the U.S. Embassy and other U.S. personnel. Jim, thanks very much. Let's quickly check in with Chad.